Okay, I believe we are broadcasting. Terry, can you confirm that?
I see that it's recording, so it should be broadcasting.
Maybe if there is an attendee who can enter a chat, if you can hear us. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to assume we're underway then, and thank you all for joining us. My name's Marty Miller. I'm joining you from Yakima, Washington, where I live and work. And I work for a nonprofit called the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing, or ORF for short. And happy to be with you this morning to talk about COVID's impact on rural housing. There have been a lot of impacts for all of us and for rural communities, from Native Americans to farm workers to just a whole broad swath of people impacted by this pandemic. This morning, I'm going to focus on two elements. One is seasonally occupied farm worker housing, and another is the rehabilitation of occupied affordable housing. So those are the two areas that we'll do a little deeper dive into, and then we'll reserve some time at the end for your questions or comments or any discussion you may like to have. Excuse me. So in thinking about farm worker housing, a little bit of context is important. For nearly a century, agriculture has been a big economic engine in Washington state. And during that time, employers, or growers, as we sometimes use as shorthand, have needed and relied upon a seasonal workforce to tend to and harvest the crops to be successful. And during that time, this past 100 years or so, plus or minus, there have been many incentives put in place to attract farm workers from near and far to help do this work. So we have a long history of trying to recruit people from other states and even other countries to try to help with help support this significant industry in our state. So this is not a recent phenomenon. It's been happening for decades, and as I said, close to a century. Every year, tens of thousands of people participate in this work. Most are permanent residents of their communities. Many travel from other states and other countries still today to do this work, and they all need housing. And so our nonprofit has been dedicated to trying to address some of those housing needs. So I just wanted to share a little of that context with you and some of the unique elements there. If you think about the overall farm worker population, again, I mentioned this just briefly, but about 70 to 75% of farm workers are year-round residents of their communities. The other 25 or 30% of farm workers are more migrant farm workers, what you might traditionally think of as people who travel from place to place during the season to harvest crops, tend crops, etc. So for permanent farm workers who live in their communities on a year-round basis, they have housing just like the rest of us do. It might be a home that they own, or it could be in an apartment that they live in. We do a lot of rental housing development for those year-round occupants that get their income from farm work. For the migrant farm worker, that 25% or so of the overall farm worker population, that's what we refer to as seasonally occupied farm worker housing, which is a permanent structure, but it's as the name implies, occupied on a seasonal basis. The seasonally occupied farm worker housing has been most impacted by COVID, and that's what we're going to spend a good chunk of today's discussion on. So I'm going to now start PowerPoint, which I hope you will all be able to see. that shares a little bit more depth on this seasonal occupancy of farm worker housing and how COVID has impacted us. So let's see. My slide is not wanting to, there we go. A little bit more about the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing, or ORF for short. As I mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization based in Yakima, where we work statewide with a focus on rural parts of Washington. We develop and preserve affordable housing, provide direct comprehensive services. We don't own and manage housing directly ourselves. We work in conjunction with other nonprofits or housing authorities that do act as the manager. We've developed a significant network of local partners, which has really been a valuable piece of our structure. We're also active in advocacy for policies and programs to bring more resources and to more effectively use those resources in the creation and maintenance of affordable housing. And ORF is also a certified community development financial institution, or a CDFI, where we have lending capital that we use to help create and preserve affordable housing in rural areas in partnership with our local sponsors, as we call them. Here's a map of our areas that we're most active in. As you can see, it's primarily Central Washington, and you can see Yakima in the kind of south central part of the state. I noticed that unfortunately we left off Oroville, which is in the very northern part of Central Washington, just north of Omak. And if anybody's from Oroville, Oroville's on the call, sorry about that, we'll get you added. But you can see this, not coincidentally, is also some of the primary agriculture producing areas in Washington state. Just as a side note, ORF is not limited to developing farm worker housing. We work on lots of types of affordable housing for serving seniors and households that are experiencing homelessness, and veterans and general low income populations. So farm worker housing has been our primary work over the years, but essentially we'll do a wide variety of affordable housing associated with rural communities. So a little more context on agriculture in Washington state. It's a big business. As you can see here with this map, 300 different commodities. We lead the state in production of a lot of things like apples and hops, and are also a big producer of cherries. And I mean, you just read the list here, and it's quite impressive. The most recent statistics I saw in terms of value is it's pushing $12 billion annually of revenue. And that's made up of, excuse me, a variety of small businesses, not just one large entity, of course, but still has a significant economic impact. A few years ago, we had some visitors from Montana State University who were trying to understand agriculture and the agricultural workforce a little bit better, and the seasonal nature of the work and the seasonal demand for housing. And they created this pinwheel chart, which I thought was very informative to have a good visual of the demand for workers and also the demand for housing. So if you look at that inner circle, you'll see the months of the year. And January is located at about 5 o'clock on what would be the dial of a clock. And as you go around clockwise over the course of the year, as you enter June, July, August, and September, you can see that's the high time of employment and the high time of demand for housing. Each of those little individuals on this graph or this chart represents 1,000 people. So, so as you can imagine, the impact on communities that require a significant amount of farm workers is big. And so housing has always been challenging. Affordable housing is challenging under any circumstance to create and own and operate. But when you add on this seasonal element where you have these high spikes of occupancy followed by months like December and January, where there's much less occupancy, it creates much more significant challenges in terms of how to successfully build it and operate it. So about in the late 1990s, growers and farm worker advocates and housing providers recognized that something needed to be done to provide more consistency and higher quality for affordable housing serving farm workers, because this is a critical workforce where it's a major economic engine, and it's the right thing to do for farm workers to have a decent, affordable place to stay. And so at that time, this group of different interests got together and agreed upon what's called the temporary worker housing regulations that are administered by the Washington State Department of Health. And what that did was it set a standard for the minimum construction elements and operation requirements and so forth that seasonally occupied farm worker housing had to meet in order to be licensed to serve farm workers in Washington State. And so that rule went into effect a little over 20 years ago, called the Temporary Worker Housing Rule, TWH, you might see referenced in certain places. And overall, it's been very successful because it's provided a standard that all participants know that if you meet this and maintain it to this degree, then it's appropriate. And the Department of Health licenses all seasonally occupied farm worker housing on an annual basis. So to assure that it's maintained in this way. Interestingly enough, for permanent farm worker housing, there's no annual licensing requirement. It's built to the regular year-round building code, and typically monitored by any funding that's associated with it, but it falls outside of the Department of Health's purview. So in the last 10 years or so, there's been a significant effort to increase the supply of seasonally occupied farm worker housing. And ORF, with our partners who serve rural communities, like in the map you saw and on a previous slide, have dedicated ourselves to creating a variety of developments for this population that's affordable and it's high quality, and it can adjust to the changing demographics of farm workers. And here's what I mean by that. We were working, one of the early adopters of seasonal farm worker housing was the Housing Authority of Grant County. And they created some of the first community-based farm worker housing in the state for seasonal occupancy. And we were talking with their staff after it had been in operation about 3 years about the demographics of farm workers. And one of the things they said was the first year was as they imagined it might be, which is predominantly single males that were potentially related, but oftentimes unaccompanied by families, and so could relatively easily share space. The following year, there was a large increase in the number of women who arrived to do seasonal farm work. The year after that, there was an increase in the number of families who were with children who were also arriving. The children would not be doing seasonal farm work, but they were traveling with their parents. And so I want to point that out just to illustrate another one of the challenges in this context is year to year, the profile of residents can change. And so creating a floor plan and a model that can adjust on an annual basis to those changing demographics is a real challenge. But we landed on what we believe is a successful model. And it's very much kind of a congregate housing type of a model. So here's some of the interiors of some of the units you just saw. An upper left-hand picture, you can see a communal kitchen where people can prepare their food. The center picture, you see some outdoor dining, and then a laundry area. And then on the lower left is bunk beds, which are typical. They're usually larger bedrooms, a minimum of 200 square feet, which for a typical bedroom is quite large. But in this way, we can try to house as many people as possible to address that large fluctuation you saw in that pinwheel graph during the high occupancy months. Each resident has lockable storage, as pictured in the middle lower row of photos. And then there's an example of another kitchen area. A few more, also a kitchen and a bedroom with some cubbies for residents to store clothing or whatever they'd like to in their bedroom. And then another example of a kitchen area. So for many years, this had been working quite well and successful, serving a wide variety of people until COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we recognized and realized that congregate housing, such as we'd been providing, was problematic because it was very difficult to socially distance from one another, given the structures and the proximity that people were realizing. And in those early days, well, actually, March, May, or April, May into June, Yakima County and other rural counties did not do well. Our COVID rates continued to increase while others were flattening the curve. Ours was rising. And in fact, some of you may have heard at the time that at a point in June, Yakima County led the West Coast on the rates of coronavirus per capita, which is not a title that we wanted, but it was a reality we were experiencing. So people recognized this and started to scramble. The governor visited, pushed hard for usage of masks. Employers recognized that this was something that they could not ignore. Advocates advocated for more personal protective equipment for farm workers. And people tried to begin adjusting as quickly as they could to this new reality. At the same time, Washington State recognized they through their temporary worker housing rules that we discussed earlier that were established in the 90s to try to create a consistent platform, determined that they needed to do something too. So Department of Health and Labor and Industries instituted emergency rules associated with temporary worker housing. And I'm going to change my screen sharing here. So bear with me just a moment as I open this other document. And here you can see this is the guidance that was published by the Department of Health for temporary worker housing that activated these emergency rules. And this guidance is still in place. And so housing providers who were serving seasonal farm workers had to comply. And so I wanted to give you examples of some of the things that in this document, you'll see references to operators, and we'd be happy to share this with anyone who is interested. And my intention here is to not be critical of the Department of Health. They were doing what they thought was best for farm workers, and we acknowledge that this is appropriate stuff. It's also very challenging. So from a housing provider perspective. So for those of you who are participating today, who are also property managers or owners of affordable housing, I wanted to give you a sense for what those who are addressing seasonal occupancy were and are continuing to comply with. So I've just highlighted a few things which I'll quickly go through here. But the operator or the housing provider must designate a person who makes all occupants aware of what their COVID plan is. They have to implement a physical distancing plan of 6 feet of separation between occupants, which includes cooking, eating, bathing, washing, recreation, and sleeping. So that's big, you know, when you have a model like we had and you saw the pictures, and now you're saying you got to keep all occupants 6 feet apart, regardless of what they're doing and where they are. That's a major challenge. In the same context, there was a determination made that only one bunk bed could be used because bunk beds are not 6 feet apart. And so if you can't have a bed 6 feet apart, then they disallowed the use of the top bunk, except under certain circumstances, which are called group shelters, which we'll spend just a moment on here too. Again, I know I'm going through lots of information, and happy to share more details with you as we after the session if people would like. Essentially, a group shelter is up to 15 people, and they have to establish their own bubble. They have to live, if they are to live together and share a bedroom with bunk beds, then they also have to travel together, they have to work together, they have to eat together, they have to shop together. And if you can do all those things, if you can commit to it and confirm those things are happening, then you can operate a cohort and have them occupy group shelter and increase the usage of some of those bunk beds and other amenities. If you can't do that, then you have to have beds that are 6 feet apart or a rigid divider, and most times you're going to have to reduce your occupancy. Some of the other, the operator also in the group shelter context must assure that the groups are maintaining their bubble even during transportation and work. Well, that's, if you're a housing authority, that's difficult to do. How can you assure that they're going to be driving together, riding together with only their group to a work site? It required a great degree of additional coordination with employers. Some are able to do that and some aren't. And if they're not, then they're probably not using the group shelter model. This is a requirement of the operator, even if the operator is not the employer. And just a couple other things. Wanted to draw your attention to the care and isolation of sick occupants. If someone gets, you know, and this again is very well intentioned, and we completely agree that farm workers, just like anybody else, it's a reasonable responsibility to try to protect health and safety. And so we want to be about that. And it's also a challenge for a housing provider that is not necessarily a healthcare provider. But so some of the rules that also came into effect was that each occupant was to have a thermometer, and the operator was to ensure that the thermometer is properly sanitized between each use. The operator must provide food and water and monitoring for farm workers who may be in isolation, and that they ensure that a licensed healthcare professional visits the occupant twice per day at the employer's expense. Again, appropriate to try to protect the health and safety, but difficult for a housing provider to accomplish because typically our partners don't have the expertise nor the staff to do this level of work. Another challenge within this is that these requirements do not come with additional funds. They're a requirement to be met, and it's up to the operator to meet them. I'll get to funding in a moment, but I just wanted to share that just by itself, those requirements did not come with funds to help make that happen. So what did housing providers do? I need to do one more adjustment here. Bear with me with my screen sharing one more time. Let's see. So housing providers implemented the changes. They began implementing the social distancing requirements and the other emergency rules. One of the things that meant for many was that occupancy declined dramatically. So remember the bunk beds I showed you earlier. For many, that meant the top bed could not be occupied. And so what that resulted in was a vacancy rate that normally, especially during the big season, would be 0, was now between 30 and 50%. And we surveyed seasonal housing providers this summer, and that's what we found was their vacancy rates ranged in that area. Well, that created 2 distinct problems. The first is that farm workers were still arriving in communities to do this work. They just now had 30% or so fewer beds that they had access to. So where were they going and where were they living? We don't know. Part of the reason we built this housing in the first place was because there aren't other options in many rural communities. The existing inventory is not adequate. Overcrowding is pervasive. Even staying in places that are not intended to be housing is a historic reality among farm workers, unfortunately. So that creates a big problem for farm workers when we, to comply with a new rule addressing COVID, have to reduce the number of beds available. The second big thing it did, and I'm sure those of you who own and operate housing this will resonate clearly, is it created a big revenue shortfall. If you go from essentially 0% occupancy to vacancy to 30% to 50% vacancy, that's a big hit. So we're left to contend with how to fill that while complying with these rules. Group shelter is one of the ways to do that. And here you can see examples of some units that are available to smaller groups of people who preferably can do the cohorts that I described earlier. And I'm watching the time, so I'm going to try to pick up the pace here a little bit. But our concern is, where will people go? And we just don't know, because they're not staying with us, and we don't have a way to find out whether they're moving into overcrowded conditions or camping, as had been done historically in areas that were not really intended for long-term use. Fortunately, some funding has been made available. The state of Washington stepped up early on, and funding came to each county to address emergency needs. With a group of advocates, we recommended that farm workers who were displaced as a result of this emergency rule should qualify as essentially homeless, and counties agreed with that. And so to the degree vouchers were available or respite type housing for COVID positive people was available, farm workers had access to that in the counties in which we worked. CARES Act money is now beginning to flow, and our partners at HUD and our partners at USDA Rural Development and our partners at the Washington State Department of Commerce have been very active and helpful participants in understanding the issues surrounding farm worker housing and trying to get the resources into the places that they're most needed. It's still a work in progress, but that partnership has been a very valuable part of the problem solving, the active problem solving that has taken place to try to bring more resources to address these emerging needs. Quarantine housing remains a big challenge. As I mentioned earlier, there's simply a lack of housing in many communities, so finding some place for people to quarantine is really difficult. Hotels are an option, but they can grow weary of being the location for COVID positive people and don't always want to play that role. So what are our longer term responses? There are a variety. We think, number one, where there is other housing available, that we could benefit from a robust voucher system that's available to farm workers so that they can pay for and use other housing when it's available. We feel there's the need for longer term options for quarantine housing, as I just mentioned recently. We would also benefit from increasing and consistent coordination with healthcare providers and promotoras who work with farm workers and trying to access healthcare, because unfortunately, farm workers are among a population that have worse outcomes when they do catch the virus, as many communities of color do. And so to the greatest degree we can preemptively limit that and avoid it, that's what we want to do. So the coordinated care is another big piece of the puzzle. We're also looking at revising floor plans for future developments to eliminate bunk beds and doing other retrofitting, like better heating and air conditioning and ventilation systems to improve airflow and improve and use better filtering. Other retrofitting, like no-touch hand towels, no-touch sinks, no-touch hand drying. There's lots of things that we think we could do to limit exposure. Additional funding is needed, but those are some things that we think are very viable to incorporate into existing housing and new housing in the future. Just checking the time, and I'm going to very quickly talk about acquisition and rehabilitation of affordable occupied housing. And then I'll stop to see what questions that we may have or comments. This is a real work in progress in rural communities. In many counties in central Washington, we're in what they call a modified stage 1 of reopening, which severely limits activities to this day. And so some of the best practices that we've tried to adopt and work with is to separate residents from construction workers to the greatest degree possible. We've even heard anecdotes of separate entrances being temporarily built so that construction workers have a different way to access the units that are being rehabilitated, and they don't cross paths with residents to try to minimize that exposure. Planning for temporary relocation is also absolutely critical. And one of the most pragmatic things we've been doing is focusing on exterior work while we try to wait for the progression of stages in Yakima County and other counties to allow safer opening. That is essentially the end of my formal presentation. There's contact information there, and you can find it elsewhere. I'm going to stop screen sharing and thank you all, and happy to try to respond to any questions that anyone may have. And you're welcome to use the chat if you'd like to, or I think Terry, our host, will likely be able to facilitate anything that folks might have.
None in the chat box right now.
Well, let me pose a question then. You know, as you could hopefully see through the Department of Health's emergency rules, they're pretty stringent, and you know, which we're doing our best to comply with. I'm not aware of any other priority population or community being served that has a similar level of requirements for the housing provider. Is anyone who's participating on this call, do they have other examples of housing that has to meet similar regulatory oversight? Okay, well, that's okay too. I'm you know, and if folks have examples later or things they want to talk about, okay, someone said assisted living facilities, good point. Right, yeah. They experienced their own significant impact of COVID early on. Anyone on participating have other examples of occupied rehabilitation that they're using or aware of that have been effective in their work that they'd like to share with the group? Okay. Well, let's see. Let me just look over my notes real quick to see if there's anything else I wanted to try to circle back to while we have a moment. Well, I did want to share some good news, and that is in Yakima County, since roughly mid to late June, which was when we hit our high point on COVID cases, we've had significant improvement. More PPEs have been distributed to farm workers and the general community. Mask wearing has increased significantly, and we no longer have that dubious title of highest rate per capita on the West Coast. We're hoping that because we had that long extended increase, that perhaps we learned our collective lesson and can avoid a second wave because it took us so long to get ahead of the first wave. Time will tell, but it's an encouraging direction, and we're trying to stay vigilant, both in the fields where our farm worker communities are active, in warehouses where there were some early outbreaks, and just among the general population. So some encouraging signs and in some of our rural communities, which we hope can continue. I see a question of, are there good examples of temporary structures that could be used in the future? Yes, there are. A number of the developments that we've worked on, we're working on retrofitting them to a couple of the more challenging areas have been bedrooms and bathrooms. So in bedrooms, what we're looking at is trying to move beds further apart, and where they can't be 6 feet apart, have rigid plexiglass or something else like that separating the bunks, and in bathrooms, to the degree there's shared areas like sinks, doing something similar where there's rigid isolation of each sink so that people can use them without breathing on one another and being immediately adjacent. Those are things we're reconsidering for future designs. As I mentioned, we're trying to the greatest degree possible, eliminate bunk beds, because we also, not only is it problematic from a COVID standpoint, but a lot of times residents, nobody wants the top bunk. I think when I don't know about you all, but when kids are younger, there's often a fight over the top bunk of who gets it. At least that was true in my house. But in the farm worker community, it's been more of our experience that nobody wants it. And so, so with that feedback and the reality of COVID, we're now looking at reconfiguring bedrooms so there simply aren't bunk beds anymore. Thank you for that question. I'll pause just another moment. I'll plan to stay on this site as long as it's possible. It looks like maybe someone else has raised a hand. Terry, I'm not sure if you can allow someone to ask a question. I see it with the hand raised. Hi, Marissa. I think you, it looks like you may have access now. It looks like you may be on mute, but if you are able to, feel free to go ahead. I'm going to see if I can unmute you. Unfortunately, I am not able to. Can you?
Hi.
Oh, there
Can you
we
hear
go.
me now? Oh, sorry. I
Yeah.
just wanted to make you aware that there's a whole stream of questions in the chat box that is not in the Zoom, but we're using the platform, the theater platform. So I just didn't know if you could see that or not. So I wanted to bring your attention to that.
Thank you. No, I'm not seeing that.
I'm happy to maybe ask some of those questions out loud right now. I don't know if you want me to do that.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll start from the bottom going up. There's a lot of questions about whether or not families are still coming. What about school for the kids? What about, I'm going to try to see if I can, there's some questions about the funding that you had talked about earlier. There's also some questions about RV communities and cooperatives, and whether or not there's any thought put there. There's a question about off-season uses for congregate housing.
Yeah.
Deteriorating homes in rural areas and maybe acquiring and rehabbing those.
Right. Great questions. Gosh, I'm sorry I didn't see this.
No, that's okay. There was a few questions before that, but I can't seem to see them in the chat above that. But I just wanted to raise some of those questions that have been raised here.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to address them as quickly as I can. We continue to see families, although they're predominantly among the year-round population who've settled out of the migrant stream. Statistically, that percentage of farm workers continues to increase. 20 years ago, it might have been 65% local residents and 35% migrant, and now it's more like 75-25. So there are families, although, and there are some who are among the migrant population, but that's to a lesser degree. There's been a real increase in the use of the H-2A program in the past 10 years or so, which are guest workers from different countries, largely Mexico, and their individuals. they may be related, but they're not, you know, mom, dad, and kids kind of a thing. RVs can be used if they are owner occupied, but generally speaking, RVs have not met the Department of Health's regulations as something that an employer or a housing provider can use. But if the farm worker has their own RV, they certainly can. Off-season use is an excellent question, and a couple of our housing providers have done some excellent work during the winter when occupancy is lower, making units available to homeless populations, which is a real win-win, that homeless households can be served, and it more effectively uses housing that may be underutilized during those winter months. The question about deteriorating housing is a good one and a real challenge. You know, there's a couple things. Sometimes the cost of rehabilitating an older unit can rival new construction. And then if you're doing it for seasonal occupancy, you also have to make sure they meet the Department of Health requirements. And one of the more significant ones is that you need 50 square feet per individual in a bedroom. So most bedrooms, especially in older homes or units, might be 100 or maybe a little over 100 square feet. So you could potentially get 2 people in there. But so you have to pay close attention to bedroom size. Thank you, Marissa. I really appreciate you jumping in like that. I know we're a little over time, but I'm happy to try to take more questions if that's possible. Okay.
It'll be stopping in about a couple minutes of recording.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
This is Terry. I believe your recording will be stopping in a couple minutes.
Okay. All right. Now, I think what was happening was when I was in screen sharing mode, I was not seeing the Zoom chat. So now I'm seeing it. And I think I am anyway. So thank you, everyone. And again, my apologies for not being able to address this earlier. So yeah, if anyone wants to try to restate a question, you know, I'm happy to try to respond. Actually, I think I'm still on the Zoom chat, so there's probably another web chat that I'm still not seeing. I'm gonna. Okay, well, I think it's 10:50. Okay, there's one new message. So let me just try to capture this last one. And okay. Yeah. So thanks for the questions. I think we're going to run out of time, and I don't want to make you late to other things, including the virtual check-ins with sponsors and whatnot. If you'd like to talk more about this with me or one of my colleagues at the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing, our contact information is on the website. So please feel free to reach out and be more than happy to share whatever experiences we have that might be helpful, not only for seasonally occupied farm worker housing, but rural housing in general. It's a challenging time, but that's what we're here to do, is to try to address these challenges and provide good opportunities, not only for farm workers, yes, and for other residents who have fewer options than many people do. and affordable housing, it can be a great opportunity that has positive impacts in a variety of ways. So that's what we'll continue to dedicate ourselves to. And thank you for your time, and I'll look forward to connecting with some of you offline. Have a good rest of your day.